Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I never thought I would end up crouched behind a toppled supply crate in an abandoned military outpost, listening for the echo of footsteps in the dark. My name is Cameron Lake, and I used to spend my weekdays as a local history teacher in Hillside County. I wasn't the type to explore old ruins or investigate secret facilities, not in my wildest dreams. But then the world changed, and everything that once seemed impossible became my new normal. It all started a few months ago, when reports of a strange infection began to circulate. Neighbors, news anchors, and online channels whispered about individuals turning pale and exhibiting lifeless eyes, as though they had been consumed by something far more terrifying than a typical virus. At first, I dismissed the rumors, but tension soon overtook our small town. People whispered the word zombie, as if it were a grim fairy tale, suddenly springing off the pages and staggering onto our streets. Overnight, much of the country was thrown into chaos. The official statements urged people to stay indoors and wait for instructions from the authorities. When the infection spread faster than anyone could contain, large parts of the region fell silent. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, and the once bustling main street in Hillside County became a deserted stretch. The local radio reported that a military detachment would sweep through to evacuate the uninfected. That announcement gave me a brief glimmer of hope. I lived alone in a small apartment near Oakwood Lane. I spent many days hiding in my bedroom while ignoring the distant sounds of commotion. Eventually, the radio broadcasts became fewer, and the static lingered longer than any human voice. Sometimes I'd catch faint chatter about a supposed safe corridor, or I'd hear coordinates referencing an outpost near Pinecrest. Then the broadcast would cut out, replaced by dead air. With nowhere else to go, and with my food supplies dwindling, I decided to follow the rumor. I packed whatever canned goods and bottled water I could find, slipped a small local map into my backpack, and left my apartment for good. The roads were unnervingly quiet. Occasionally, I spotted shapes in the distance, figures that shuffled or dragged themselves along the sidewalks. I recognized them immediately for what they were. Their hollow eyes and unsteady gaits gave everything away. They were exactly what the rumors had described. I did my best to evade them. Some were slower, some advanced with a grim determination, and every single one fueled my rising concern that the entire world had transformed into a nightmare. Without my car, it had been stolen or abandoned. I never found out. I had to rely on my own 2 feet. Several times I ducked into drainage ditches or behind rusted vehicles to stay out of sight. Those creatures were not the only threat on those roads. I sometimes heard distant engines or saw groups of desperate survivors sprinting for safety. On the 3rd day of traveling by foot, I encountered an older woman named Joyce, a former cashier who recognized me from a grocery store in Hillside County. She was huddled in a small tool shed with 2 younger folks, Alan and Maria, who had lost contact with their parents. They shared what little information they had. Alan said he once overheard chatter on a shortwave device about a functioning army outpost at Pinecrest barracks. I latched onto those words with everything I had left, somewhere to turn, somewhere the infection might be under control. The next morning, the 4 of us started walking at dawn. We moved carefully through deserted streets, weaving past vehicles with shattered windows and broken headlights. We paused whenever we spotted anything that moved. Sometimes we glimpsed 1 or 2 of those undead shapes beyond a fence, moaning softly. They seemed locked in an endless search, drawn by any spark of motion or sound. We pressed on as quietly as possible. Eventually, we reached a muddy back road that branched toward the old Pinecrest barracks. Even before we saw the walls, we noticed signs of a conflict. Trees along the roadside were scorched, and the remains of burnt-out vehicles dotted the shoulder. A thick layer of ash clung to the air. Broken bits of metal and discarded equipment told a silent story of a desperate stand. we decided to push on anyway. When we finally reached the perimeter fence, I spotted a few large blockades formed from sandbags and steel rails. Although there were no guards visibly stationed at that moment, the gate leading into the outpost was slightly ajar. Joyce insisted we wait and watch from a distance, so we took shelter in an overgrown ditch with tall grass. We noticed no patrols, no lights, only an unsettling stillness. After a few hours, Alan said we should take a chance. If the army was inside, we needed to contact them and see if we could get help. Rations, medical supplies, anything. My own exhaustion and thirst overshadowed my doubts, so I agreed. We eased around the gate and slipped into the main courtyard. Crates were scattered everywhere, many labeled with faded stencils, medical, rations, emergency. Most were empty or pried open. An eerie hush enveloped every corner. Maria found a first aid kit near an abandoned Humvee, though it contained only basic bandages and a few antiseptic wipes. I noticed a sign pointing to the barracks themselves. The large concrete building stood in the center of the compound. Every window looked shuttered, and the main door was sealed. "Should we try to get inside?" Joyce asked softly. Alan nodded and we crept over, stepping gingerly to avoid making noise. We had no idea if undead beings roamed the halls or if army personnel remained inside. Alan and I tested the heavy door. To our surprise, it opened with a creak. Beyond it, a dim corridor stretched out in front of us. The air felt stagnant. Our only light source was a flashlight that flickered whenever the batteries lost contact. We saw discarded helmets, occasional bullet casings, and muddy footprints that vanished into adjoining rooms. We whispered to one another, trying not to let our voices echo. The further we ventured, the more we realized there had been a chaotic retreat. Fold-out cots lay overturned, crumpled blankets were scattered across the floor, and a few battered lockers had their doors hanging off the hinges. We found no sign of the living, nor did we see anything undead. The silence weighed heavily, as if the building held its breath. Eventually, we discovered a small storage room that still had an intact door. Inside, we found some boxes of canned food and a stash of water bottles. It looked like someone had carefully organized supplies, but never came back for them. Maria's eyes lit up with relief, and we took turns greedily drinking. We decided this storage room would be our temporary hiding spot while we figured out our next move. Nighttime came quickly as we waited in near darkness. Even though we were all exhausted, none of us truly slept. Every small noise in the hall or the faint groaning of the wind outside forced us to sit alert. I glanced at my watch, nearly 3 a.m, when I heard what sounded like a dragging sound beyond the storage room door. I gestured for everyone to stay silent. We listened intently. The sound moved past us, then receded. At first light, we summoned the courage to explore more of the barracks. We discovered a few bodies in a side corridor, fallen individuals in camouflage uniforms. We didn't linger to examine them closely, but we noticed they seemed unresponsive, with no sign of movement. The corridor led to an administrative office with a half-open door. Inside, I found a desk with scattered papers. That was where I stumbled upon some records referencing Protocol 18, civilian containment. The documents seemed to be daily logs from the days when the infection began spreading across the nearby towns. The logs mentioned attempts to quarantine large groups of people. The pages indicated confusion about who might be infected and who was healthy. The final entries were shorter, almost frantic. Resources running low, no reinforcements, overwhelmed by hostiles, some soldiers refusing orders. One note felt more chilling than any other. Shots fired on unarmed individuals approaching the perimeter. Command insists it's necessary. My hands trembled as I read. It was obvious that the soldiers had been dealing with more than they could handle, and at some point, they began viewing desperate refugees as threats. I shared this with Joyce, who quietly read the lines on the crumpled pages. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes told me everything. If we weren't careful, We could be misidentified as threats ourselves, if any active military personnel still wandered these corridors. We pressed onward, stepping into what appeared to be a briefing room. Chairs were overturned, and a projector screen hung askew. Maria wandered to the back and opened a small closet. She called us over, pointing to a stack of notebooks and a battered handheld radio. We quickly realized the radio might be our best chance to call for help beyond these walls. While Alan fiddled with the device, trying to get any kind of signal, I examined the notebooks. They contained rosters of assigned soldiers, emergency procedures, lists of supplies. One page caught my attention. A short list titled, Quarantine Subjects, Observations. The names included men, women, and even a child. There were lines that read, no signs of infection, but quarantined anyway. Another line said, order from above, do not release. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became that the army had been following strict orders, even when they did not align with moral lines. I felt uneasy, like the ground itself was shifting under me. We had entered this barracks seeking safety, but the records suggested these walls had witnessed harsh decisions. When Alan finally got the radio to sputter, he looked excited, though the signal was weak. At first, all we heard was static, then there was a voice cutting in and out. Anyone, Pinecrest, respond safe. And then it vanished into white noise. Alan tried adjusting the dial, but we couldn't pin down the signal. We decided to keep the radio with us and search the rest of the facility for a better vantage point, maybe a roof access or communications center. We gathered the extra water bottles and some canned goods from the storage room, hoping we could make it through another day. Moving further into the barracks, we found an area with bunk beds. The entire floor smelled stale, like it had been shut up for too long. We paused at every corner, worried we might encounter undead shapes. But the corridors remained eerily still. At one point we stumbled upon a small infirmary next to a room labelled quarantine. The infirmary was in disarray. Toppled supply carts, medical tools scattered on the ground, and a few cabinets pried open. The place looked as if someone had grabbed whatever they could and fled. In a corner, we found half a box of medical masks and a nearly empty container of rubbing alcohol, items that once might have been used to control infection. Then we noticed the locked metal door across the hallway. Quarantine, read a sign in bold letters. The top corner had deep scratches. I touched them lightly, feeling rough edges. Was it from someone trapped inside, or something else? None of us said a word as Alan reached out to test the handle. We discovered it was bolted from the outside. A wave of unease passed between us. If something had been locked in there, was it still inside? With a quiet nod, we decided not to open it. There was no point in risking confrontation with someone infected, or worse. We backed away, glancing at the scratched metal as if it might spring to life at any moment. An hour later, we found a small operations room with filing cabinets. It seemed to be a place where soldiers mapped out local movement of the infected. Colored pins on a wall chart indicated sightings in different neighborhoods. There were taped-up photos, some featuring large groups of civilians, others showing infected masses at the edge of a chain-link fence. Scrawled notes hinted at how quickly the undead population had grown. One message read, "We can't hold them off. Something must be done." I tried to focus on the map to see if it revealed any path to a safer location. The color-coded lines suggested that the nearest stronghold was over 100 miles away and had been cut off weeks ago. That left us with minimal hope for outside rescue. If we wanted to survive, we'd have to rely on ourselves. At that moment, we heard something clang in the corridor behind us. Maria motioned for us to be still, and we felt a creeping tension. A low sound, almost like scuffling, drifted to our ears. It was too rhythmic to be random. We quickly switched off our flashlight. Alan silently gestured for us to back up into a corner, away from the doorway. In the glow of the faint emergency light that still flickered overhead, we watched a silhouette pass by the room. The figure wore some type of uniform, but we couldn't see more details. It moved with smooth confidence, almost as if it had a clear objective. This was not one of the undead. We all exchanged looks, uncertain if this individual was friend or foe. We waited until the steps faded down the hall. Then we carefully peered out. The corridor was empty. Without speaking, we formed a silent agreement to follow at a distance, in case this person had answers or supplies. We crept along, trying not to give ourselves away. A few turns later, we spotted an ajar door at the end of a hallway. Faint lantern light emanated from inside. We crept closer, listening. A muffled voice spoke, though it was impossible to catch every word. I heard brief mentions of orders, containment, and no survivors. My heart felt uneasy, but I kept quiet. Then we heard something that made us all exchange fearful looks. The person mentioned secured the entire block, followed by a statement that they had encountered more survivors. They noted they took care of them. Alan motioned for us to step back, but we were too late. The door suddenly swung open, revealing a soldier with a short-trimmed beard. He spotted us instantly, and we froze. The soldier's eyes shifted between the four of us. I thought I saw a flicker of shock, or maybe regret, but it was quickly replaced by tension. He lifted a sidearm, though not pointed directly at us yet. "Hands where I can see them," he said in a firm voice. We complied. Joyce tried to speak, but her voice faltered. She managed a few words. "We came looking for help." The soldier glanced behind himself, as if he was about to call someone else. Instead, he stepped forward and eyed each of us. "You're not infected?" he asked. We all shook our heads. Then he examined us closely, his gaze lingering on any scratches or bruises. Eventually, he gestured for us to lower our hands. "My name is Corporal Isaac Holcomb," he said. "You shouldn't be wandering these halls." We exchanged uncertain glances. Alan stepped up, his voice shaking slightly. "We came here after hearing about a refuge. We found logs saying you were evacuating civilians." Isaac frowned. "Those logs are outdated. This place was overrun. Most of the unit pulled out weeks ago." I asked, "Why are you here?" His eyes darkened. "Following orders." Something in his tone felt unsettling, but I pressed on. "Is there any chance for us to get to safety?" He hesitated, looking down the corridor. "If you came here, you already know how dire things are. The original plan was to protect uninfected civilians, but we lost contact with command. Now it's just me." Maria glanced at the sidearm. "You're alone?" He nodded. "Most others retreated or didn't make it." There was a tremor in his voice, but he kept it buried. Finally, he gestured for us to follow him into the lit room. It turned out to be a makeshift quarters. A single lantern flickered on a table strewn with maps. A field radio was propped in the corner, but it looked damaged. The entire setup seemed improvised, as though he had been waiting for something, or someone. We explained our situation, how we had come from Hillside County, and discovered the barracks deserted. Isaac took in every word without much emotion. When we asked if he knew of a safe haven, he simply gave a short answer. No guarantee anywhere is safe. Alan's frustration finally broke through. "So you're telling us we came all this way for nothing?" Isaac didn't reply right away. He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck and glanced at the documents on the table. A large chart showed different sectors around Pinecrest. Some were marked with red circles, others with scribbled exclamations. "What about the transmissions we caught?" I asked, referring to the radio. "We heard someone mention a location that might still be standing." Isaac shrugged. "I've tried every frequency on that radio. If you heard something, it might be a recorded loop. We can check, but it's best not to get your hopes up." Despite his measured tone, we could sense that Isaac was hiding something, or at least withholding details. Joyce looked uneasy, but none of us dared to question him further. Any help was better than none at all, and if this outpost still had supplies or a plan for escape, we needed his cooperation. Over the next few hours, Isaac shared a small portion of his rations with us. We learned that he grew up in Northern Falls and enlisted straight out of high school. When the outbreak began, His unit was dispatched to Pinecrest Barracks to establish a stronghold. They faced hundreds of undead in the surrounding towns, and chaos took over. The orders to hold the area eventually devolved into instructions to enforce a total quarantine. Some soldiers abandoned their posts, while others followed protocols to the letter. When Alan asked about the mention of no survivors, Isaac's jaw tightened. "We were told to be thorough," he said. "Once the infection took hold in a sector, no one was allowed out." He left it at that. Night fell again, bringing with it that same oppressive hush. We decided to take turns resting, though true rest was impossible. Isaac claimed to have secured a few areas of the barracks, but warned us not to wander around too much. He wouldn't say why, though we guessed it had to do with the locked quarantine room, or something worse. Close to midnight, a faint scraping noise sounded from the hallway. Isaac grabbed a flashlight, signaled us to stay put, and stepped outside. For a long while the corridor was silent. Then we heard soft footsteps returning. He came back in, placed the flashlight on the table, and looked more tense than ever. "You're not safe here," he said abruptly. "I thought I had cleared every corridor." We demanded to know what was out there. He wouldn't clarify, only stating, "A problem." Then he insisted we gather our supplies because we had to relocate to a more secure section of the barracks, maybe near the motor pool where an armored vehicle remained. Maria and Alan traded uncertain looks, but we packed our things, not wanting to question him in that moment. We followed him through a series of dim hallways, stepping around debris, occasionally pausing while Isaac scanned corners with the flashlight. The air smelled stale. At one point we passed that same locked quarantine room. The door was slightly ajar now. My stomach churned, but we moved on without comment. We reached a reinforced section near the back of the compound. The hall led to a large metal door with a keypad. Isaac tapped in a code, and the lock clicked open. Inside was a garage with two large vehicles. One looked like a heavy transport truck, the other a battered armored carrier. Tools and spare parts were strewn around. Isaac claimed we could barricade ourselves in here if something approached, but he also mentioned that if we could fix the armored carrier, we might escape. The carrier had a busted engine part, and we lacked the right tools. He rummaged through a workbench, swearing under his breath when he couldn't find what he needed. Alan began to help him, while Maria and I stood watch near the door. Joyce rested against a stack of crates, her face etched with weariness. During our search, I found a small notebook tucked away behind some dusty spare parts. It looked like it belonged to another soldier, maybe a mechanic who had been stationed in this garage. I flipped through the pages, noticing daily entries about repairs and supply requests. The final lines made my pulse quicken. Ordered to enforce the highest level of quarantine. No one in, no one out. The captain insisted we manage every arrival. Morale is broken. Heard rumors about civilians being turned away even if they had no signs of infection. I gripped the notebook, thinking back to the battered logs we found. The entire situation felt more sinister than a simple attempt to keep the virus contained. I glanced at Isaac, who was busy discussing engine parts with Alan. His expression remained stern. Was he simply doing his duty, or was he aware of the harsh methods used? We spent the next few hours barricaded in the garage. Beyond the walls, occasional metallic clangs echoed. Maybe debris falling, maybe something else. The tension in the air was thick. Isaac kept checking his wristwatch, mumbling that we had to move before dawn. At one point, Joyce asked, "Are you sure it's safe to go back outside?" The compound gates were wide open when we arrived. Isaac nodded. That means the infected could wander in. Staying in one place too long is dangerous. That explanation seemed logical. Still, none of us felt relieved. As we tried to rest, I found myself unable to stop thinking about the diaries, logs, and orders. I remembered how we had seen evidence in the corridor that the soldiers had made harrowing choices. Was Isaac truly alone? Or had he been left behind to carry out final instructions? Something about his clipped answers and unwavering demeanor kept me on guard. Dawn arrived, pale light filtering through high windows. Isaac directed us to gather anything we could use, and we prepared to leave the garage. He claimed we needed to check one last storage area for the correct engine component. If we found it, the armored carrier might work, and we could drive out. We stepped back into the corridors, once again moving in near silence. As we passed the administrative office where I'd found the logs, a loud crash made us freeze. The sound came from near the quarantined room. Isaac raised a hand, indicating we should wait. Another noise rattled the corridor. Maria's grip on my arm tightened, though she said nothing. Isaac signaled for us to follow him as he advanced carefully. When we neared the hallway that led to the infirmary, we saw the door to the quarantine room standing fully open. I resisted the urge to call out. The door looked twisted on its hinges. Beyond it, the darkness seemed to shift, as if something inside had been set free. Isaac gestured for us to hurry past, and we obeyed, not wanting to find out who or what was in there. We eventually reached a locked storeroom. Inside, shelves were packed with mechanical odds and ends. Isaac began rummaging for the engine component, while Alan stood guard by the door. The rest of us lingered in the middle, scanning the shelves in case we saw anything useful: spare batteries, radio equipment, or additional food. It was then that we heard an anguished noise echoing from the corridor. I couldn't tell if it belonged to a person or something else. Isaac tensed, dropping whatever tool he had been holding. We realized the corridor was no longer empty. A low moan resonated, accompanied by dragging footsteps. We had encountered the undead before, but something about the presence moving toward us felt more aggressive than usual. Alan slowly eased the door shut, and we all stood motionless. The noise outside intensified. There was a jiggling of the door handle. At that moment, Isaac hissed that we had to hide. There was a bank of tall shelving units in the storeroom, creating a narrow gap that we quickly squeezed into. Isaac, Joyce, Alan, Maria, and I pressed ourselves against the shelves, hoping the darkness concealed us. After a tense few seconds, the door creaked open. A figure shuffled in. I could see only part of it through the space between boxes. It moved in unnatural bursts, making quiet, rasping breaths. I noticed the tattered remnants of a military uniform on its frame. The creature gave off a sense of sorrowful corruption, as if it had once been a loyal defender but was now something twisted by the infection. I held my breath, trying not to make noise. The figure advanced further into the storeroom. Tools clanked under its feet, and the scraping of metal against the concrete floor grated on my nerves. I felt dread weigh on me. Maria gripped my wrist, her face tight with fear. The creature lingered for a moment, then turned around slowly. Finally, it began moving back toward the corridor. After it left, I sensed the group let out a collective exhale. Isaac motioned for us to remain silent a bit longer. The corridor sounded busy, as though multiple beings shambled through it. Eventually, the noises receded. We emerged from our hiding place, our nerves on edge. Isaac clutched a metal part that might be what we needed. We realized we had to make a quick escape. We retraced our steps toward the garage, taking care not to draw any unwanted attention. Every so often, we paused at an intersection or listened for that same rasping sound. At last, we reached the heavy metal door with the keypad. Isaac input the code again, ushering us through. We bolted the door behind us, sealing out whatever lurked in the corridors. Then we rushed to the armored carrier, our hearts set on escaping the base. Isaac wasted no time trying to install the part. Alan handed him tools, and they both worked with impressive speed. While they tinkered under the hood, Maria, Joyce, and I kept watch. If a crowd of infected beings or anything else tried to break in, we would have precious little time to respond. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually Isaac slammed the hood shut, hopped into the driver's seat and tried the ignition. At first, the engine struggled. Then, with a reluctant rumble, it came to life. We felt a flicker of relief. We hurriedly loaded our minimal supplies into the back. Isaac maneuvered the carrier toward a large set of double doors that opened onto a rear access road. The thick gates loomed ahead, locked by a chain. Isaac pointed to a control panel on the wall. "Someone needs to unlock those gates manually," he said, glancing at the rest of us. Alan volunteered to go, but before he reached the panel, the sound of screeching metal echoed through the garage. Something was battering at the door behind us. The keypad beeped from the repeated impact. Our time was running out. Alan raced to the wall, smashing the emergency override switch. The chain on the gate began to clank and slowly unwind. Isaac revved the carrier's engine, ready to burst through as soon as the path was clear. The pounding at the door intensified. Joyce gripped the side of the carrier, her expression grim. In what felt like the longest 30 seconds of our lives, the gate swung open, revealing a bleak morning sky. Isaac roared the engine and pulled out onto the cracked concrete outside. Alan leaped onto the side step just as the carrier lurched forward, slamming the door behind him. We sped away from the barracks, relief mingling with dread. The outpost behind us was no sanctuary. It had become a place of hopeless decisions and monstrous transformations. Whatever had once given the soldiers purpose had been lost to the chaos of the outbreak. Once we were a safe distance from Pinecrest, Isaac slowed the vehicle. We realized we had no clear direction. The road stretched before us in uncertain lines. Alan tried to pick up that faint broadcast again on the handheld radio, adjusting the dial. We heard only static. "What now?" Maria asked. Isaac stared straight ahead. "We search for any sign of another outpost, somewhere people might have regrouped. Maybe there's a functioning stronghold left." We gazed back at the towering shape of the barracks, now fading into the distance. It stood as a grim reminder of how easily everything can fall apart when fear and desperation take over. I still recall every detail of that place. The oppressive corridors, the locked quarantine door, the battered journals revealing difficult orders. Even though we escaped physically, part of my mind remains trapped there, replaying the silent hallways and the flicker of that lantern in Isaac's makeshift quarters. It's a memory that refuses to fade, etched with the realization that the infection was only one part of our problem. In the time since, we've roamed abandoned highways, skirting past slow-moving clusters of undead, hoping to intercept any military convoy or rescue squad. Though Isaac has stuck with us, there's still a gap of trust between him and the rest of the group. None of us have said it aloud, but we all suspect he knows more about what truly happened at Pinecrest Barracks. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the locked door with the scratches and the official logs referencing containment. I wonder how many innocent people were taken to that room under suspicion, never to walk free. The fact that Isaac was left behind to follow through with certain directives gnaws at me. Yet we also rely on his skills and knowledge to survive. Our fragile alliance is built on necessity. At odd moments, I catch him lost in thought, staring into the distance with a haunted expression. Perhaps he regrets certain orders. Perhaps he wishes he had never been posted to Pinecrest at all. I can't fault him entirely. In a world turned upside down, moral lines blur in terrifying ways. We press on, seeking the faint possibility of normal life. The roads remain lined with evidence of chaos, abandoned cars, rubble, shattered storefronts. We meet other survivors here and there, all telling similar stories of guarded compounds, turning away the desperate and official forces implementing heavy-handed policies. My hope is that, somewhere out there, a real sanctuary exists. But the memory of the Pinecrest Barracks outpost reminds me that even trained defenders can become dangerous when driven by panic. If we ever do find a safe haven, I pray it's run by those who remember empathy, not just directives. For anyone who hears this account, understand that Pinecrest Barracks is not a place of shelter. Once, it might have been a beacon for survivors, a stronghold that promised order amid chaos. In reality, it devolved into a labyrinth of suspicion, leaving behind a single soldier torn between orders and conscience. As for me, I now realize that the real test of humanity in an apocalypse goes beyond avoiding infection or undead creatures. It lies in preserving kindness and compassion, even when the world collapses around you. Because the greatest threat isn't always the zombies lurking beyond the fences. Sometimes it's the fear and desperation within those who claim to protect us. And so our story continues. We traverse highways littered with broken remnants of civilization, searching for supplies and fleeting signals on the radio. Isaac keeps the armored carrier moving, Alan scans the frequencies, and Joyce and Maria stand watch. I record these moments in a small notebook, hoping that someday someone might read these words and learn from the mistakes made at Pinecrest Barracks. If you ever find yourself approaching a place that was once a military facility, be cautious. Barricades and barbed wire do not always promise safety. Sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden behind official emblems and locked doors. If the world ever recovers from this undead plague, let our cautionary tale serve as a reminder. Courage without conscience can lead to devastation, and authority without empathy can be as harmful as the most relentless horde of zombies. We hold on to the faintest shred of optimism, telling ourselves that each mile traveled might bring us closer to something better. But the lessons of Pinecrest Barracks stay with us. Never assume that an official presence guarantees refuge, and never lose sight of your own humanity in the face of chaos. That is all we have left, each other, a battered armored carrier, and a reminder of the consequences when fear takes command. May our next sunrise bring a kinder chapter, one that proves this nightmare can end without losing who we are. Until then, we move forward, preserving whatever hope remains, clinging to the belief that somewhere out there, beyond the darkness, lies a place untouched by the horrors we have seen, or at least a place that learned to resist them. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.